Hi, I'm David Brigham, librarian and CEO at the Historical Society of Pennsylvania, HSP, and it's our delight to welcome you here this afternoon to meet Bob Frischman. Bob has a gorgeous new book out called Edward Duffield, Philadelphia Clockmaker, Citizen, Gentleman, 1730-1803. Bob is a horologist, a clock expert, and he has repaired over 8,000 clocks. Bob, is that the right number?
And counting.
And counting. And he is an expert who is regularly called upon at conferences and symposia about clock history. He has spoken at all the major museums who collect early American decorative arts, including the Metropolitan Museum, the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, and Winterthur. This book is a great scholarly achievement and tells us about a clockmaker about whom we knew relatively little. And he's going to share some of that knowledge and also tell us what he learned in HSP's collections, which are one of many archives that he consulted. So Bob, welcome to HSP.
Great.
We look forward to learning from you today.
Thanks so much.
Okay.
All right. It's a thrill to be here. You know, one of my missions in life is to get backstage at all of these kinds of institutions, especially when they contain information that I want to see and use in my research. I do need to acknowledge and recognize my good friend Ed Kane, who loves to fund material culture publications. He's funded previous books on other clockmakers, including Rittenhouse and the Stretch family here in Philadelphia. And he very generously underwrote this project, as well as being a significant benefactor and donor to the Historical Society of Pennsylvania. So there's a great synergy here, and it's wonderful that some of the work that I've been able to do is because of people like Ed Kane who can support these institutions. So the genesis really was that Edward Duffield was an important figure, not only as a clockmaker. So this is not a clock book. You don't have to be a gearhead to like this book. You can page through it and for pages on end be reading more about Philadelphia history and kind of the history of the science of clockmaking without page after page of gears and technical information. It really has very little of that, just enough to understand it. But probably another distinction is that a lot of these clock books in the past have not been written by people who were at the bench for 44 years, as I have been. And they often are deal a lot with the furniture aspects of these beautiful, particularly long case clocks, with which clockmakers like Edward Duffield had absolutely nothing to do. Edward was not a cabinet maker. If Edward wrote an autobiography, it would not have been about Philadelphia case making or furniture making. Edward made the machinery that's inside these. And a lot of clock people, of course, buy them because the cases are beautiful, but that is not what Edward Duffield's story is about, and that's why my book differs in some ways from other clock books which focus on the furniture aspects. And even if it says Edward Duffield or Thomas Stretch on the dial, those guys were not woodworkers, and the cases really are unrelated to the kind of magical work they did on the hidden things that are behind the dial and actually make the clock a clock. Until relatively recently, when people said clock, it was the machine. So you look in estate inventories and all, and as they were listing these often most expensive things in someone's household and inventory, it would say clock and case to differentiate the machinery from the cabinet, which someone had nothing to do with. So a biographer's hope is that their subjects have left behind papers, invoices, inventories, account books, letters. In my case, there was almost none of that. There's couple of known letters. There are a couple of artifacts, and some of them wonderfully are here. We're going to look at them. But I really had to piece his story together from other public documents and horology know about how clocks and watches were made, serviced, and sold in the 18th century. And that's a big part of my book and a part about the story, because the way clocks were made was not someone melting down grandma's brass candlestick and making a clock gear. A lot of these clocks were made by specialists, and then somebody like Duffield would do the final finishing and assembly to get a finished clock. But the kind of romantic notion of a guy sitting there by a flickering candle with his buck knife, making an intricate machine that had to keep time within seconds a week, is fanciful and far obsolete by the time that Edward started. Fortunately, at the HSP, there's an account book by a contemporary of Edward Duffield's, and it was a wonderful thing to look at because even the script looks kind of the same. This is the fellow who advertised. Edward almost never advertised. He didn't need to. He was a rich guy. He had inherited a lot of money from his grandfather, who was one of the first settlers of the Philadelphia area, not a Quaker. He came as a Presbyterian, became an Anglican because that church was even more prominent and full of the city's leaders who were not Quaker. But fortunately, again, we have an account book that even the handwriting looks enough like Edward Duffield's, because we know from a few artifacts. So we're now looking at Thomas Morgan's account book and ledger, and we're seeing the kind of entries that would have been in Edward's ledger too. And I hope both that we discover Edward's ledger someday, and I hope that it contains the kind of information that I'm telling you here. Because, for example, we're open to a page here, and these were always organized by the customer. So we see, in this case, we see Benjamin Rogers, and we see the costs of what these servicing were done. We see this is a 1773, which is still within the time when Edward was working. I should mention he began in 1752 when he reached age 21. He at first was selling capers and raisins and probably learning clockmaking, perhaps from the Stretches who lived nearby, who were prominent clockmakers. But we can see some certain entries, including one which was typical of most people, and I assume Edward did this too, where we see that he had a contract for winding the clock for 6 months in this case, and he was charging for that. So not only did the clockmaker like Edward and like Thomas Morgan visit your home weekly to wind your 8-day clock, meaning weekly winding, but so he would come and do that and make sure the clock was working properly. But just as important, he brought the time, because otherwise there were no radios, GPS, television. The only way you knew the correct time was if the clockmaker brought it with him on his watch, because he determined the correct time, or if you had a sundial. But it's hard to actually see the exact time unless you had a very elaborate kind of specific sundial, like the one example that's in my book, which Edward made. The issue with sundials is that the sun time varies a little, so you need a table for every day of the year telling how many minutes to subtract or add, but you needed that. So again, if a clockmaker came to your house, he brought the time with him. So in this, for example, we show that this guy came, he charged him for every 6 months. This is another great example of the issue I was talking about, of the divisions of labor and how Edward didn't make things from scratch. Because we're seeing in this case, you see he's finishing an English clock. So my contention, and I believe it's verifiable and true, is that these parts, mostly these clock parts, were from England. They were fabricated there. They came on ships up the river, and they were rough parts. You still had to be highly skilled to turn them into a clock that worked. But in this case, here's in black and white almost, he's finishing an English clock. So he had the rough parts and he was putting them together. And maybe in this case, this customer had imported the parts or brought them to Edward and said, or to Thomas Morgan in this case, and said, here are the parts, finish it up and make me a beautiful English clock. And quite frankly, at that time, the rich people wanted English imports. They didn't want something that some country bumpkin was making. If they had English clocks, English silver, English furniture in their house, those were the prestige items. So Edward was competing really with English craftsmen, as a lot of the furniture makers and silver makers all too. They had to have equal skills and hope that the local, nobility almost would say, well, maybe I should buy something from Edward Duffield and not just send an order to London to my agent in London to send it along. So let's see if we find one more thing here. To just see, and here's new lines in the clock here, and repairing his watch. So these folks, of course, were repairing watches. You have to remember that the term watchmaker almost then certainly, and now certainly, those guys were not making watches, they were repairing them. If you bring your Rolex in to be serviced to the watchmaker, he's not going to make you a new Rolex. He's going to clean, and if it needs parts, use the parts that are fabricated in the factory there too. Yeah, so here's repairing. Let's see, I'm just going to go to one more because this could be something also. Let's see. Okay, yes, repairing his watch, repairing his clock, and some watches here too. And there were purchases of clocks too. Let's see if just in this one last page. Winding his clock, cleaning his watch, and cleaning his clocks. But we also have some purchases of clocks in here as well, where they indicated moon dial perhaps was being purchased. And you saw the price of them. It was, again, perhaps the most expensive thing beside the house itself that these people could afford to buy. So we can, one wonderful collection that HSP has is a collection of watch papers. And these were, and we see a selection of them here. These were little paper discs that were pressed into the back of pocket watch cases to show who perhaps had sold the watch and who had serviced them. And often on the reverse of these papers were handwritten notes by the watchmaker or the clockmaker indicating the service history of it too. So, but as you can see, these were beautifully engraved, and they put as much detail as they could. Sometimes these even have those equation of timetables, so you can look at your sundial and then compare it to your watch if you're trying to set it accurately too. There's some great examples here. This is again in the HSP collection. Thomas Voigt was a very important watchmaker in the Philadelphia, the same way Edward was. And I only know of one Edward Duffield watch paper. It's at Winterthur, but we have some great enlarged detail of it as a page of my book, which you can hold up here. So this is obviously 50 times the size of a real watch paper, but I thought it would be important to let you really see what the detail, and if that amount of engraving is incredible. And Edward was an engraver. We know that he engraved things as well as made clocks and watches, and we see that he also had a dial sign. This was awesome. There were trade signs. Houses at that time really didn't have addresses. People would find them by the street location and then by a trade sign hanging outside. So almost certainly this means that he had some wooden painted imagery of a clock dial hanging outside of his shop at the corner of Arch, which used to be called Mulberry Street, changed to Arch Street because there was an arch down at the waterfront, and 2nd Street. So unfortunately, that building isn't there anymore, but we know that that's where he lived. He was there 24 years doing his business as soon as he had inherited that clock from his rich grandfather. So his personal story is there too. There's lovely examples of watch papers, although they're actually fabric, too, that would get pressed in here. And sometimes these have personalized messages because maybe they were even stitched by someone's daughter or wife or girlfriend who was hoping to be the wife. So there's great things. These are patterns for watch papers too. So there's really some treasures here. And guys like me love to collect watch papers if we can. I do have a small number of them myself, but someday, if the stars aligned, I'll find an Edward Duffield watch paper, but at least we knew of one so that we could know what they looked like. Speaking of engraving, we know that Edward was an engraver, and he engraved the first peace medals that were produced in 1757, ordered by the Quakers in Pennsylvania, the General Assembly, because they were trying to, maintain friendly relations with the Native Americans who were here. So Edward was hired as an engraver to create the die for this. He didn't actually stamp the medals. That was something that a silversmith did, but he created the imagery and the lettering on there and was paid. So this, this is a documented expense from the General Assembly, the Quakers, the Quaker group. So it's lovely to have an example of this. This is a replica. If this were an original, I would have my white gloves on, I'm sure. But part of Edward's story is everything else about him besides his clockmaking. So the chapters of my book certainly deal with his horology, the science of watch and clockmaking, but we know a lot more about that too. So we have perhaps the most exciting thing I've seen related to Duffield, besides the 71 clocks and instruments that I document in the catalog section of my book, is this ledger book by Joseph Graysbury, who was probably the most upscale tailor in Philadelphia during Edward's time. And he produced the uniforms for the local militia. And guys like Edward would periodically come in there and order nice suits of clothing. So we can fairly specifically from this ledger page see the kinds of clothes that Edward was commissioning, not only for himself but for his sons, his two sons, and even for his Negro man, who also has a listing there. I did have to consult with a textile historian to understand what some of these fabrics are. We see some interesting spellings of things. The first line, for example, we can zoom in again and we can see that this was for his son Benjamin, who had not yet gone off to medical school in Edinburgh and then become a local famous doctor. But you see, it's for his coat, interesting spelling, and breeches, interesting spelling as well. So we can see all these, and when you see this X across the whole page, this means that the account was settled. And you can see on the side there, it's also telling you it was paid in full. But whenever you look in these ledgers, I suppose for the sake of the guy whose ledger it was, you want to see the X on the page, because that means the guy got paid. And sometimes it took years for people to get paid. But just randomly, I just said, well, let's look. Was there a second page here? And we look, and by God, here's Lambert Cadwallader's tailor bill on the next page. So we're finding more serendipity in a way too, because in my book I show a Peel portrait of John Cadwallader with his wife and infant, wearing clothing that would have been similar to what Edward was wearing, because again, we don't have an image of Edward's fine waistcoat and silver buttons, but we see that in the Cadwallader portraits. And just by, again, a lovely coincidence, here we have the record, and again we see that the Lambert paid his tailor bill, but we see what he was wearing, and we can look at also at the Philadelphia Museum of Art at a portrait of Lambert Cadwallader, as well as the other one I just mentioned, to see probably the clothes that we see that he's had made and paid for in this wonderful ledger book that's here. One of the most important things about Edward that people cite all the times is his lifelong friendship with Ben Franklin. Franklin was 24 years his senior, but when Franklin ran away from his older brother James and came to Philadelphia as a runaway apprentice, he ended up, we know from Franklin's autobiography, he ended up walking by the home of the woman he later married, Deborah Reed, and he ended up as a boarder. The first place that he boarded and had a bed was in the home of Deborah Reed, and exactly next door to the right was the Duffield family home in the city. And this was even before Edward was born. But right away, the Duffields and the Franklins were connected geographically, and then there became a lifelong friendship. Franklin's illegitimate son William was born just 2 months before Edward in 1730. So clearly, these boys must have grown up together, known each other that whole time. Edward then moved a few blocks north, but his whole boyhood was spent in that home next to the Reed House when he wasn't out at the family estate that his grandfather had about 10 miles north of Philadelphia in the Torresdale area at an estate called Benfield. There's one known picture of that you'll see in my book. It was demolished in 1898, but that's where Edward in 1775 decided to relocate because and essentially give up clockmaking. He already had this estate out there. It was a prosperous working farm. But in 1775, as we know, things were getting pretty hot with the English. If Edward was importing British parts, he might have had trouble with boats coming in carrying both tea and clock parts, which locals weren't receptive to receiving or unloading on the docks. So we had those kinds of issues. And people were starting to get nervous. Money was tight, and if people were not buying the clocks he was making or even having them repaired, which was a more important part of Edward's work, was the repairing and the traveling to wind people's clocks and set them, then he might have said, why am I doing this? And things are getting a little dicey here with all our problems with the English. So let's move. Let's go and really spend full time out there at Benfield. So we're pretty sure that at that point he not only gave up his shop, we know who took over his shop, an advertisement of that, and we know that he relocated out there, and that's the time where he gave up his 13-year contract to service the public clock in the Pennsylvania State House, which is now Independence Hall. So we very prestigious job. The clock was constructed by Thomas Stretch, the son of Peter, the famous clockmaker, and they both were famous clockmakers in Philadelphia. There's a great book by them as well, about them as well, that's worth reading. And you see that Edward had the contract for 13 years. He was paid £20 a year to maintain the public clock in the tower. And clearly that was a high-stress job, because if his clock work failed up there, the entire city would know. Suddenly you're not hearing that bell ringing every hour, and they rang it for other reasons too. They sometimes call it the butter bells would ring because that announced the opening of the market. But Edward lived just 2 blocks away, so if he were lying in bed at night and it's 3 a.m. and he doesn't hear that bell ring, he probably got up then to go over and see if some pigeon had landed on the movement inside, and he had to deal with it. It's unfortunately that movement, that Thomas Stretch movement, is no longer in existence. It's kind of a sad story because eventually they put a tower on Independence Hall, or the State House, not long afterwards, and put a different movement inside. And the Stretch movement went to a Catholic church nearby, which about 40 years later was burned to the ground by the Know-Nothings in anti-Catholic rioting. And there's eyewitness accounts saying that that clock, which was the clock that Edward serviced a half century before, pealed 10 o'clock for the last time as flames engulfed the belfry. So it's some story of Philadelphia religious intolerance, which of course would have horrified the city's founder, William Penn, who really created this community based largely on religious tolerance. So we now can address the final, again, that final chapter where we talk about their lifelong friendship of Ben Franklin. One thing that Franklin did was appoint his friend Edward as an executor of his will, and not just the final will in 1790, but he wrote an earlier one when he was traveling to England to try to reconcile the Pennsylvania colony with the British, eventually, of course, unsuccessfully. So Edward even initially was an executor as a much younger man, but when Franklin died in 1790, Edward was one of the 3 executors of the great man's will, and Edward didn't need the money, he didn't need to be paid to be an executor, but he was gifted Franklin's Waywiser, which was an early type of odometer that told somebody how far their carriage had traveled. And that's in the Franklin Institute, and it has registered about 1,600 miles, so we think that it's the odometer that Franklin had on his carriage when he made his postal inspection trips as the British appointed postmaster for the British colonies. And a family, a nice connection that's sort of family, sort of technical too. And this is a kind of wonderful thing that I was thrilled to be informed was here. Edward's sister married Ebenezer Kinnersley, and he's sort of the forgotten close collaborator of Ben Franklin in all of their electricity experiments. When those guys were electrocuting turkeys and blowing up model buildings with lightning, when he was trying to encourage people to put lightning rods on places so they wouldn't be exploded by a lightning bolt. It was Ebenezer Kinnersley and perhaps Edward himself helping with building this equipment and writing lectures that then were given, because Kinnersley traveled all around the North American colonies lecturing about electricity. And what's here in this collection is this 1752 handwritten manuscript by Ebenezer Kinnersley, the husband of Edward's sister, Edward's brother-in-law, who in these pages talks about these electricity experiments, and they clearly were notes for the lecture series that he began to deliver both in Philadelphia and then up and down the eastern seaboard. So to have something in Kinnersley's handwriting is great. He unfortunately got ill and he passed away fairly young, but he also was employed as a professor and kind of a dorm parent at the Philadelphia Academy, where he was a professor as well. So he was an educated man. He was trained as a minister, but he had some religious disputes with his church, and kind of went into these technical things as well. So here you can sort of picture Franklin is there with Edward's brother-in-law and perhaps Edward himself, and they're playing around with electrical things. Some of those early machines and experimental things are in a case at the library company right next door. You can see those things. So here's again, you can almost channel and picture these great men, really, Edward as a young man and his brother-in-law and Franklin doing these things, and clearly their friendship went throughout their whole lives. Franklin wrote many letters, of course, back home from England, where he was for overseas 17 years, and then in France longer. And in a number of those letters, please give my love to the Duffields. Franklin's daughter, Sarah, spent many summers and all out there with their family, especially during the Revolution when they needed a refuge. And Duffield's mother-in-law, Mary Parry Smith, was Deborah Franklin's closest friend for 50 years. When she died, there's a wonderful heartfelt letter from Sally Franklin, Benjamin's daughter, writing to Benjamin saying, poor Mrs. Smith died and mother is distraught, and so were all the Duffields, because her best friend of 50 years has passed away. So there's a nice progression sort of through my book of Edward's early history, including his grandfather who came from England, and about his clockmaking, and then his clothing, his relation to Franklin, and then finally the catalog where you see more than 60 Duffield clocks, all that I could discover, including one standing in my home. I'm happy to say, honored to say that I'm its trustee, and then and then also some of his surveying instruments that he made, and the one sundial that he made. So as I always try to emphasize, this is way more than a clock book. It's a Philadelphia history book by somebody who is very important, but somebody who has not really been known until I was fortunate enough to study his life in some detail at places like HSP and be able to create a book that I hope a lot of you will want to read and own. Happy to take some questions and talk further if we have more to say in this very brief introduction to a 260-page book that has 227 illustrations too, so it's a wonderful picture book. But I've tried to pour everything into it, where my motto kind of was, I want to write the book that I want to read. So, and I still can't believe it's my name on the cover, because this is exactly the book that I would want to read about Edward Duffield, even if I hadn't written it myself.
We have some questions in the chat. Fred Moore asks, please comment on the Duffield clock once located in the Lower Dublin Academy front tower.
Yes, and that's an interesting story because that's the only building left that Edward designed. He was one of the designers and builders, overseers of the Walnut Street Jail, but he also, probably because his grandfather was a developer too, Edward had abilities to design and be a contractor in a sense for these buildings. So the Lower Dublin Academy was one of those. And if you can go there, you can see that building, and it has a large, about a 6 foot, maybe 4 foot opening in the top pediment above the front door where a clock made by Edward Duffield was mounted. It's disappeared long ago, unfortunately. I don't think it was burned up by rioters. I think it was just scrap metal eventually. But there's a story which I cannot verify and I question. One of the other main things, this anecdote about Duffield, is that outside of his shop at the corner there of Arch and Second, he had a two-sided clock, and supposedly Franklin said, "You need a clock outside your shop, Eddie, because people are bugging you all the time. They're coming in to ask what time it is," because that was a service really that clock shops provided. People would set their watches and clocks by going in and bugging the guy trying to build a clock by asking what time it was. So supposedly there was this clock outside of his shop hanging on the wall. However, the first notice of such a clock by Edward was written almost a century later in stories about Edward. And plenty of diarists, plenty of visitors went to Philadelphia during those years, and not one of them ever wrote about this landmark two-sided clock sticking out at one of the most important intersections in the city. So I'm not sure that it wasn't just a painted trade sign like I talked about before that he hints at on his watch paper. And I think perhaps he had some other clock that he built for somewhere else and it was later installed in the Dublin Academy, or he built a clock for the Dublin Academy at that time. But it's controversial, and all these early histories about Duffield always talk about that innovative big clock at that corner, but I really can't find enough evidence that it existed at that time. I'm in trouble now, probably.
Another question: how did learning more about Duffield's family and biography affect or change your understanding of Duffield's work and practice?
It really confirmed what a tremendous scholar and predecessor of mine, Robert Cheney, who runs the Willard House and Clock Museum up in Grafton, Massachusetts. In the year 2000, he wrote an article in the magazine Antiques, really talking about the English origins of a lot of the Willard family clocks. Simon Willard, Aaron Willard are famous New England, Boston area clockmakers. And he was a clockmaker like me, but I think probably even better than I was, knew a lot about Willard clocks. And he was starting to see that Willard clocks made at almost exactly the same time, signed in Boston, were different inside. And he said, why would they have done that? Wouldn't they have templates? Wouldn't these parts be the same? And then he learned that these parts were being made in England and shipped to Boston and Philadelphia. So his conclusion was that these guys, again, were not melting down the candlesticks and making these clocks from lumps of metal. And often they were either entirely English in origin, or they were of English parts that were put together. So, this impressed me. Robert got in a lot of trouble about this. There are people that like to imagine these early craftsmen sitting there again with their candles and buck knives making stuff. But he, I think, definitively proved that that wasn't the case. And certainly that affected all kinds of horological historians like me to pursue this line of thinking. And I think it was verifiable by the things I found out about Duffield as well. Clearly, he knew how to make clocks. Clearly, he made them. He wasn't IKEA. He didn't just put his name on a clock. But he wasn't, melting down pieces of brass or trying to forge steel to make these clock parts. He was dealing with some levels of specialization and mass production in a kind of way in order to put these clocks together. So I think that was an important lesson, and it's what reviewers and all have focused on too, that I'm really revealing, and again, perhaps in an equally compelling way, that horology in the 1750s, 60s, and 70s was very different than a century earlier, and it really relied on a lot of prefabrication of the parts that these guys were then finishing and assembling. Again, a watchmaker in 1751 sitting in Philadelphia was not able to make parts that were the size of your eyelash. There were specialists in London or Birmingham and Liverpool who were specialists in that, and that's all they made was that one part the size of a house fly maybe, that then got assembled by a watchmaker. So even if Edward were a watchmaker, and I saw early claims that he made the first watch in North America, these stories just generate and then self-perpetuate. But it wasn't the case at all. There are watches with Edward's name on them. I don't have any or know of any now, but there's advertisements saying that there were Duffield watches. And those have his name on them, but those were English watches that his name was signed on, and that was the practice.
Bob, thank you. This is fascinating. I'm sure a lot of people are going to want to buy your book. So how do they do that?
Okay, certainly Amazon is a place where it's easiest perhaps for people to sell it, but I have a website I created right at the beginning of the process so that people would contact me if they have Edward Duffield clocks. So I would learn about them, and I did. But it's edwardduffield.com, and if you want a signed copy, I'm happy to sell you one through that website, or you can order through Amazon, or the distributor and partner of the American Philosophical Society that published the book. They are now partnered with the University of Pennsylvania Press, and there's order information and forms through Penn Press, where the book can also be offered. But I'm going to guess that either people want a signed copy, which I'm happy to sell through me, or they'll go to Amazon and they can, get reading right away the next night, right? It'll probably appear overnight, and they can not put it down until the wee hours because it's such a great book.
Bob, thank you. You're a great storyteller, and thank you for diving into our collections and illuminating them. I'm most fascinated by your use of luxury tailor and how that helps us to imagine Mr. Duffield and how he presented himself to the other gentlemen and ladies on the streets of Philadelphia in the 18th century.
Are we going to see your tailor bill in here someday?
I'm afraid I'm off the rack, Bob, but nonetheless,
Okay,
this is a great talk, and you've taught us a lot, and made us, those of us who are not clock experts, that you taught us a lot about how this craft actually worked, and the relationship to other trades like furniture maker and the scientific community, and how they served public buildings and some of the wealthiest private homes, and how a man like Edward Duffield might come to know and become friends with an acknowledged person like Ben Franklin. So what a great story. Thanks for sharing it with us, and thanks for sharing with our audience how important HSP's collections for historical studies like this. So wonderful.
Thanks so much.
Okay, we look forward to the next book.
It's coming.
Okay, very good.